Well, good morning and welcome to the Avenue. My name is Wright. I'm the campus pastor here at the Avenue Church Ennis campus, and it's really been an honor for me, a privilege over the last month or so to be able to teach and share with you guys some of the things that God has placed on my heart over the last few weeks. And before I get started with the message today, I have something important that I want to tell you guys about that's coming up in our church. One of the biggest events that we're having all year is coming up in just a couple of weeks. So one of the things that makes the Avenue Church such an incredible place is the volunteers. You see it every single Sunday. It would not be possible for us to have church every Sunday without the hundreds of people across both campuses that commit their time and effort to volunteer and to make this place so great. And so once a year, we have an event for our volunteers. And this year, we're having our event on August 7th. It's called Connect. It's going to be on a Sunday evening. It's going to be at our Waxahachie campus at 6:30. We're all going to come together at the Waxahachie campus. And this year, it's going to be unlike anything that we've ever done before. It's just going to be awesome. And so you've heard us the last few weeks talking about how we're going to revamp, how we're going to change our volunteer experience. And those words can be scary sometimes when we talk about change and revamping the way we do things. But the reason we're doing this is because we want to make your experience as a volunteer as great as possible. And especially for those people who are starting to volunteer for the very first time, we want to make sure that that process is a lot smoother and easier than it is right now. And so we're kicking all of this off at our Connect event, Connect 2016, that's happening on August 7th. We're going to be showing you guys what it means to be a volunteer at the Avenue, how you can be a part of it, and what we feel like God has planned for us in the coming year. And one of the great parts about this event is that we get to come together in one place. On Sundays right now, we're one church, but we meet in two separate locations, and so we don't always get to be together. And this will be one of those times during the year where we all come together in one place. And so I'm asking you guys to help me represent the Ennis campus well. I think you guys are pretty awesome, and I tell everyone that you are, so I need you to back me up here, if you could help me out. So if you're a volunteer right now, go ahead and sign up. This event is for you. If you're not a volunteer, I still encourage you to sign up, because this is a great way to learn about what it means to be a volunteer at our church. So even if you go to the event and you decide it's not for you, it's not a big deal. This is just a time to come and check it out. So you can sign up now online at the events page on our website at theavenuechurch.com/events. There's a link to it. It's called Connect 2016. And I promise you guys, you're not going to want to miss out. Our staff has been working on this for several months now. We just want to make it a fun night. It's going to be a great time. We're going to hang out afterwards, but we're also going to spend some time talking about what it means to be a volunteer at the church. So I ask you guys, if you're a volunteer, even if you're not, go ahead and sign up. It's going to be awesome. Well, today we are finishing our series, Stories of Summer. Over the last 2 months, you've heard from myself, you've heard from our senior pastor, David Brown. We've been sharing stories both from the Bible and both from our own lives that have affected us in powerful ways. And so today, I want to finish our Stories of Summer series by sharing what I think is one of the most powerful stories in the Bible. It's a story that perfectly sums up God's incredible love for us. And honestly, it's a perfect picture of what the gospel is in our lives. Today, I'm going to share with you guys the parable of the Prodigal Son. And if you're here several weeks ago, when I preached on a few other parables, you heard me say that parables were stories that Jesus told in order to cause people to think about something in a new way. And as we study this story today, we're going to see how this parable that was told over 2,000 years ago is still just as powerful today as when Jesus first told it. And we find the story in Luke chapter 15. It's in a series of other parables. And during this time, Jesus is teaching the crowds that had been following him for quite some time. And these crowds really consisted of two main groups of people that were following him. One group consisted of what you might call sinners, for lack of a better word. These were people who were generally looked down upon in society because they were making poor choices. They were obviously doing bad things in life. The second group of people consisted of religious people. Now, these were the people who strictly followed all the rules, all the Jewish customs, and were perceived to basically be doing everything the right way. They were supposedly living a good life. So as Jesus is telling this story, he manages to powerfully speak to both groups at the same time. And amazingly, he's able to powerfully speak to us even 2,000 years later. You see, as we read this story, we're going to be able to identify with it in so many ways. And I think that's the beauty of this story, is that we can relate to it on so many levels in our lives. So we're going to read this story in parts, and we're going to see how it unfolds into an incredibly powerful and unexpected ending. So we're going to start with the first part. In Luke chapter 15, we're going to read verses 11 through 20. And if you have a Bible, I encourage you to follow along. If you have it on your phone, that's not a problem for me. But if I see you walking around like this, I know you're just trying to catch Pokemon and you're not actually following along. So make sure you at least pretending like you're reading the scripture as well. So we're in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 20. It says, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father." Now, there's a lot to get to in this story. There's a lot of details that really flesh out the power of this story. And so I want to start with the younger brother's initial request for a moment. The story doesn't quite convey how big a deal it was for him to go to his father and ask for his inheritance. Even now, we understand the concept of an inheritance. It's something that we do. When we die, we pass along our possessions and our money to our kids. And it was the same in that culture. And just like as it is in our culture, this only happens when you die. So think about it in that context. The younger son goes to his father and basically says, "I love what you have more than I love you. In fact, I wish you were dead so I could go ahead and have the money that you have." Now, if you have parents who are alive, imagine how they would feel if you went to them right now and asked them the same thing. If you are a parent, imagine if your child came to you and asked the same thing that the younger son is asking his father. This is one of the most hurtful things a child can do to their parents. It's basically telling them that all they mean to you is what they're worth. It's a horrible, selfish request. It's basically saying, "I wish you were dead so I could have your money." It's terrible. And even still, the father in this story did something crazy. He gave his son what he asked for. And most of us, if our kid asked us that, we'd slap him a little bit like, "You're crazy, get out of here. There's no way I'm doing that." But the father did what his son asked. Now, in that time, almost all of their wealth was tied up in land. So this wasn't just as easy as the father writing a check to his son and saying, "You know what? Here you go." This meant that the father had to go out and sell some of his possessions, land, livestock. It was a very agricultural society. It took a lot of work for him to go and get the materials together to give him a third of his inheritance. And more than that, a lot of your standing in society was tied up in the land that you had. So it would have been very humiliating for the father to sell off some of his land because everyone knew what he was doing. So he was losing standing in society and he was losing part of his possessions. It took a lot of effort in order for him to give his son what he was asking for. It was a difficult process and it hurt the father in so many ways, but he did it anyway. You see, the father loved his son so much that he was willing to let him leave home. He wasn't going to force his son to love him. He gave his son the opportunity to choose, knowing that his son was not going to choose well. And after the younger son receives his inheritance from his father, he goes off to a faraway land, which inflicts even more pain on the father. Leaving your family in that time was just as bad as asking for your inheritance early. Sons were expected to carry on their family's way of life. They were expected to preserve culture, traditions, and customs. They were expected to carry on the family name. It was a big deal at that time. So by leaving for a far-off land, the younger son is basically saying, "I disown everything that this family stands for." It's a rejection of their way of life. It's a rejection of the legacy of that family. And the younger son went searching for something new. He went searching for something better than his own family. And it's important to note that for a moment, he found it. For a very brief period of time, he found pleasure and happiness. He had something to offer, money, and everyone loved him for it. Everyone wanted to be his friend. He was probably very popular at that time. It says he squandered it on wild living, so he was probably throwing huge parties for all his friends, and he was probably the most popular guy around for a time. But he found a love and acceptance that was conditional. because their love only lasted as long as his money lasted. When his money ran out, their love, when he no longer had anything else to offer. Now, maybe some of you are starting to identify with this story a little bit. Have you ever left the presence of the Father in search of love and acceptance in something else, searching for pleasure and happiness, only to be used up and cast aside by the world? Have you ever tried to reject the ways of the Father, to go out on your own and find a new way, only to come to the realization that it's impossible to find unconditional love anywhere else in this world? That was the realization that the younger son finally came to when his money ran out and the famine hit and he had nothing to eat. He had stooped so low that he was feeding pigs, and even the food that he was giving to the pigs seemed appealing. That's how hungry he was. But it finally hit him. He came to his senses. He realized what a terrible mistake he made, and he said, "What a fool I've been. Even now my father's servants are in better shape than I am. Maybe, just maybe, if I go home and I beg for my father's forgiveness, he'll let me become one of his servants, because surely that is better than where I am now." When everyone else had abandoned him and he had nothing left, he had a choice. He could have chosen to just give up and die, or he could have chosen to return to the only thing that still remained with him. Because no matter how much he went out and squandered and wasted away all of the inheritance he had, there was still one thing that stayed with him: his family. One thing that he couldn't throw away even if he wanted to. And so somehow in the midst of this string of terrible choices, he makes one small right choice. He decides to go home. But even as he's returning home, he's still holding on to a piece of his rebellion. And we see that in his way of thinking. When he thinks about becoming one of the Father's servants, he's thinking about earning back the debt that he owes. He's thinking about, how can I make this right again? How can I fix this? He knows he deserves a punishment, but he thinks, maybe I can minimize this punishment. Maybe I can work my way into making it right again. And honestly, he's too scared to become a son again. So he asks to come back to the Father as a servant, because he knows there's a lot more responsibility in being a son. As a servant, he can still run away again. As a servant, he can still reject the Father again. But as a son, if he comes back as the Father's son, he can't handle that responsibility. He knows he's being restored into the Father's family, and he can't leave again. And so for him, it's easier to be a servant. He'd rather just earn his way back, pay his debt off, not worry about being a part of the family anymore, but at least be in a better situation than where he was when he had nothing left. He doesn't fully understand the love of the Father. Have you ever noticed yourself trying to do the same thing with God? When you run away from the Father, do you find yourself making deals with him when you come back? Do you find yourself saying things like, "God, I'm so sorry for what I did, but I promise that I'll do this, this, and this. I'll work really hard to make it right. I can fix this. I know I messed up, but I can fix this." When we do that, we're still trying to maintain a small piece of control. Instead of asking for God's unconditional forgiveness, we try to remain a part of the solution. We try to fix it by ourselves. But just like the younger son, when we do this, we don't fully grasp the love of the Father, the forgiveness that the Father has to offer. If we go to God as servants making deals, we too can run away again. We can reject the Father when we're not fully restored as his children. It's a lot easier to come back to God as his servant making deals, because we can leave just as easily, instead of accepting his full forgiveness and being restored as a son. And by accepting the Father's forgiveness unconditionally, we're making room for a new person to emerge. We're allowing ourselves to be fully restored as his child. And so the younger son is still trying to maintain control when he's making these deals. Let's pick back up the story again and see how the Father responds when his son does return. Back in verse 20, it says, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. And what an incredible scene this must have been. The father took off running the moment he saw his son off in the distance. It's almost as if he was waiting for his son, knowing that he would return. In the moment he sees him, he is so filled with joy that he takes off running instead of even waiting for his son to get closer. It's important to know how Jesus' audience would have understood this part when he talked about the man running out to his son. Because in that time, men did not run. Children ran. Sometimes young men ran, but a distinguished man, a distinguished member of the community would not run. Because in order to run, you had to lift up your robes, exposing your legs, which was very disrespectful. Now, for some of us, it might be disrespectful to do the same thing, but for a different reason. This was a customary thing. To lift up your robes and expose your legs was very disrespectful. But the father didn't care. He didn't care about standing in the community. He didn't care about social customs. All he cared about was that his son who was lost had now been found. His son who was dead has now become alive again. And so he runs out to his son filled with joy. And before his son can even try to recite his prepared speech about becoming a servant again, the father cuts him off immediately. He calls for his other servants and he says, "Quick, clothe him in the finest robe, put a ring on his finger and put sandals on his feet." And this is more than just clothing. It's more than about just giving him something nice to wear. These articles of clothing symboled his standing in the family. So by putting this robe on him and ring and sandals, he is fully restoring the son to be a member of his family. No questions asked. And on top of that, he throws a party for the entire community to celebrate that his son has returned. It doesn't matter what the son has done. It doesn't matter the mistake that he has made. Now, if you think about this, the whole community already knew about what had happened. It was kind of difficult for the family to try to hide that their son had run away. The community saw the father selling all his land and possessions in order to give it to his son. So they knew that the son had humiliated the father. It wasn't a secret. And yet, in spite of all that, the father ran to meet this son who had humiliated him. He threw a party for the entire community to celebrate because he was so filled with joy at his son coming home. He even used the fattened calf, which is a big deal at that time. It was something that they saved only for the rarest occasions to celebrate. It was something that didn't happen very often. That's how much this meant to the father. He took the symbol of celebration that they had, something that they rarely used, and basically used it to throw a party for the entire community. This thing could feed the entire community. So they all came together and just had a big party to celebrate that this son had come home. The father didn't care that he had messed up. He only cared that his son was home. And if the story ended here, it would be a beautiful story of forgiveness and restoration. But the story doesn't end here. Up to this point, the story only applies to one of the groups that Jesus is talking to, the sinners. These are the people who had quite literally run away from home and made poor choices, just like the younger son had. So they could relate to this. They could understand what was happening. But there's still one more group that Jesus needs to address, and we find them in the last part of the story. Starting in verse 25, it says, "Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has come back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours,'" notice how he doesn't say, "my brother," "when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" So as they're throwing this party, there is one person who does not want to celebrate. There's one person who is not very happy about this, the older brother. The story is often called the lost son or the parable of the prodigal son, but really it should be called the parable of the two lost sons. Because as we read about the older brother, we find out that he is just as much at fault as the younger brother, but just in a much more subtle way, in a way that's perceived to be doing what's right. First, he refuses to go into the party. Now, this is incredibly disrespectful to the father. He has thrown a party for the entire community, and the older brother is publicly rejecting what the father has decided to do. He is publicly humiliating the father by protesting the party. That sounds familiar, right? There's another person in this story who has publicly humiliated and publicly rejected the father. The older brother's doing the same thing that the younger brother did, just in a different way. And there's really only one reason that the older brother is upset. By restoring the younger son back to the family, more than just becoming a son, the younger son gets back another inheritance. By becoming a son, he has a right to inherit what the father has left. Remember, the younger son has already taken a third of what the father originally had and wasted it. None of it is left. And he comes back, and of the 2/3 that are left, the father restores him completely back into the family. So now the younger son is entitled to a third of what's left. This cost the older brother something, because the younger brother has already wasted away a third of it, and now he comes back and he's entitled to a third more, which means that the older brother gets less. The father's forgiveness cost the older brother something. I want you guys to hold on to that for a second, because we're going to come back to it. It's so important. The father's forgiveness cost the older brother something. The older brother is upset about money, and we see that by his words. He basically says to his father, I've worked my butt off for you. I've followed all of your rules. I've done everything you've asked, and you've never once rewarded me. But this deadbeat comes home after wasting everything. And not only do you throw a party for him, but you restore back his inheritance, even though he wasted what he already got. All along, the older brother cared about the same thing that the younger brother did: money. The younger son was just open and blatantly asked for it. The older brother had been quietly working for his share. He had been quietly following all the rules, but he was working towards the same thing. He was just trying to go about it in a way that wasn't perceived to be so wrong. When they should have been worrying about how to love and serve the father, both sons were worrying about what they could get out of their father. The father loved them both and wanted the best for them and did everything he could to allow them to be a part of the family. But they both were working for the same thing. The younger brother was open and blatant in his defiance. The older brother was quiet and tried to put on the front that he was doing what was right. And even when the older brother is defiant at the end, even when he's publicly humiliating the father by refusing to go into the feast, the father is still forgiving and loving. He says, my son, even though your heart is just as wrong as your younger brother's heart, I love you, and everything I have is yours. In order to truly be a part of this family, you have to care about your family more than you care about money, more than you care about yourself. Because right now, all you care about is yourself. But even still, I invite you to come and celebrate. Will you join me? And at this point, the story abruptly ends. We don't find out what the older brother does. We're left wondering what he will choose. Will he decide to go in? Will he run away now? What will he do? And Jesus does this on purpose. Because of the two groups that he was talking to, both of them were going about life the wrong way. The only problem was that it was only obvious to one group, the sinners. They knew they had it wrong. They were obviously making bad choices. But the religious people, just like the sinners, only cared about themselves. They were after the same thing. They chose to go about it by trying to gain the favor of others and by doing what's right, by following all the rules. But they were just as much in the wrong. There are really two competing views of life here, and they're both wrong. There's self-indulgence and self-righteousness. One group was working by self-indulgence, and the other group was working by self-righteousness. Now, one of these is supposedly bad, and the other supposedly good. But Jesus changes everything by coming to them and saying, neither of you have it right, but only one of you knows it. Both of the brothers were using their father for their own selfish gain. That means for us that we can rebel against God by rejecting him, but it also means we can rebel against God by following all the rules, by doing what's right for the wrong reasons. Both of these ways of living, self-indulgence and self-righteousness, get it wrong. Do you see the common word in both of them? Self. That's all they cared about. Even though the older brother was doing what's right, he only cared about himself. One is rejecting the Father by leaving his presence, and the other is rejecting the Father by his hard work, by following his rules in order to get something out of the Father. And notice how at the end of the parable, the Father is inviting both brothers to the feast. And which one is more easily able to accept the invitation? The younger brother, because he knows he's messed up. The older brother way of thinking says that not everyone deserves the Father's love. Some people are better than others. Some people are more deserving of the Father's love than others. When we think like the older brother, we reject others based on what they do. This is one of the most dangerous ways of thinking you can find in a church. If we think like the older brother, we start sending people away because we think they're not good enough. We decide that they've made mistakes and they're not deserving of the Father's love. We try to take God's forgiveness and decide who to give it out to. This is so dangerous in a church. We cannot think this way. It is so important that we examine our hearts and understand how the forgiveness of the Father works. And do you know how we do that? Do you know how we examine our hearts and know? We do that by looking at the example of the true older brother. Now remember how I said earlier that the Father's forgiveness cost the older brother something. Well, even though Jesus doesn't finish telling this story, he fulfills it later on in his own life. We find our perfect example of the older brother in Christ Jesus. You see, our true older brother came to the Father on our behalf and begged for our forgiveness. In fact, he offered his own life in order that we might receive the forgiveness of the Father. Our true older brother didn't care that we did not deserve the forgiveness of the Father. He didn't care that we had publicly rejected and humiliated the Father. Our true older brother came to the Father on our behalf to ask for our forgiveness. More than that, he was willing to pay what it cost for our forgiveness. He was willing to pay with his life in order that we might be accepted back into the Father's family. In the parable, the older son could not accept the cost of the younger son's forgiveness because of his selfishness. All he cared about was himself. But Jesus, our true older brother, knew that being a part of the Father's family was what mattered the most. And he was willing to accept the cost of our forgiveness. So when we read this story and we see the two competing views of the self-indulgence, the self-righteousness, we're left wondering, if both of these are wrong, then what do we do? If seeking after pleasure and happiness is not the way to go, if seeking after acceptance and meaning by following all the rules is not the way to go, then what do we do? Jesus answers that question with his death and resurrection. He says you drop the self in all of your thinking. You get rid of self in all of your thinking and focus on the love of the Father. Don't love the Father because you can get something out of him. You love the Father because he first loved you when you didn't deserve it. And so as we do that, we learn how to become like our true older brother, Jesus Christ. And the best part is, when we do that, we find what both of these groups were looking for. One of them was looking for pleasure and happiness, and the other group was looking for purpose and meaning. And in Jesus Christ, we find the truest forms of both. We find joy. We find meaning in Jesus Christ. but we do it by humbling ourselves, by getting rid of selfish thinking and focusing on the love of the Father. So I have to ask you, have you found that true joy and meaning in Jesus Christ? Are you like the younger brother? Have you gone out on your own, leaving the presence of the Father, rejecting the Father, searching for pleasure and happiness, only to find that nowhere else in this world can we find unconditional love? Are you like the older brother? Have you tried to be a good person? Have you tried to follow all the rules, only to realize that it's not good enough, that it's not enough? No matter who you are, the Father is calling. He is inviting you to be a part of his family. He is inviting you to receive his unconditional love and forgiveness. He's inviting you to the feast, to celebrate. He wants you to be a part of his family. Will you accept his invitation? So this time I want to ask you guys to bow your head and close your eyes, and I'm going to take a moment just to pray over you. And after I do, I want to give you guys the opportunity to reflect and respond to how God is speaking to your heart. If you need to pray with someone, we have people at the back of the room who want to pray with you. If you feel led to respond by taking communion or praying with someone around you, I encourage you to do that as well. This is a time of reflection. And Father, in this time, we open our hearts to you. We ask you to show us what it means to be a part of your family, what it means to accept your love. Father, we know that we don't deserve your love. Some of us are like the younger brother. We've run away, and we're too scared to come home. We're too scared of becoming a son again. Father, show us your love. Show us how that all you care about is that your son who was lost has now been found. Father, others of us are like the older brother. We follow the rules. We've done what's right. And it's still not enough. And it's hard for us to accept that. For those of us who think that way, God, we ask that you would soften our hearts, that you would show us your incredible love, how not a single one of us deserves it, but you choose to offer it to us anyway. Allow us to celebrate with those who have found your love. And most of all, Father, we ask that you show us how to be like our true older brother, how to be like the one who came and paid the price for our forgiveness, not caring what it cost him. Show us how to be like him, how to find joy and meaning and purpose in him. Father, we love you, and we ask all of this in your name. Amen.